sheet. We can't say exactly how long it takes, but when ice sheets do begin to disintegrate, the process becomes very fast. Now, to turn to observations of current, what's happening in response to the rapid increases in greenhouse gases in the last few decades, we see that the sea ice, the Arctic sea ice, the amount we began to measure from satellites in the late 1970s, and the amount there fluctuates each summer depending upon the weather that summer, but overall it's decreasing quite rapidly. And this year's summer sea ice, the Northwest Passage was open again for the second time in the last few years, and those were the first times in recorded history. And, we're going to lose all of this Arctic sea ice. If we continue on business as usual, within the next few decades, we will lose all of this Arctic sea ice in the summer. There are also effects on Greenland, which the red part is the area where the summer melt. And again, we have accurate measurements from satellites beginning in the late 1970s. The area with melting fluctuates from summer to summer, but it's increasing. And that meltwater will go to a low spot on the ice sheet, burrow a hole in the ice sheet, go to the base of the ice sheet where it lubricates the ice sheet, and it speeds up the discharge of these giant icebergs to the ocean. And we can now measure very precisely the mass of the ice sheets using the gravity satellite, which has been up there for only 6 or 7 years. But we see that during the winter, the ice sheet gets heavier, and then during the melting season, it loses mass. But overall, it's now losing mass at a rate of more than 200 cubic kilometers per year. And Antarctica is also losing mass. And what's a little scary about this is the fact that the rate at which it's losing mass seems to be increasing. And that's the tipping point that we don't want to see happen. Right now, sea level is only going up 3 centimeters per decade, which is not negligible. It's more than a foot per century. But the danger is that this is going to fall off the edge, and we'll get meter scale sea level on time scales of decades. Another effect that is expected of global warming is an expansion of the circulation cell, the rising motion in the tropics and the subsidence and the subtropics, which causes the subtropics to be dry. That circulation cell is expected to expand as the planet gets warmer. And we observe empirically that it has expanded by about 4 degrees of latitude on the averaged over all longitudes. And that's one of the reasons that Lake Mead and Lake Powell are only half full. It's also one of the reasons that forest fires in western U.S. have been increasing, and also in the Mediterranean region and in Australia, which are also bordering on the subtropics. And these fires now burn hotter, and it's much more difficult for forests to recover as these fires burn hotter, because it burns the seeds as well as the trees. Glaciers are receding all over the planet, in the Rocky Mountains, the Andes Mountains, the Himalayas, the Alps. Glaciers are receding, and this is very important in some regions because some of the major rivers of the world have more than 50% of the water during the dry season coming from the melting glaciers. So once the glaciers are gone, then you'll have bigger floods in the spring, but the rivers will tend to run dry in the dry season. Another effect is on coral reefs, which are under stress for several reasons, but 2 of the most important ones are the warming of the ocean water, which causes the coral to expel their symbiotic algae and die, and the acidification of the ocean. As we increase the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, the ocean becomes more acid, and those animals that have a carbonate shell or carbonate skeleton are harmed. In fact, they can't live as their shells begin to dissolve. It becomes too acid. So for all of these reasons, we argue that if we want to keep a planet that resembles the one that has existed the last 12,000 years, the time that civilization developed, we should decrease CO2 to no more than 350 parts per million. The most quantitative way to estimate this is the one I mentioned earlier. We know how far the planet is out of energy balance. If we want the Arctic sea ice to stop melting, then we've got to restore the planet's energy balance. And that means reduce CO2 by at least 35 to 40 ppm. So it's very clear that if we want to preserve a planet like the one we know, we need to do that. And that means that we can't burn all of the fossil fuels. The purple parts are what we have burned already and put into the atmosphere. If we would phase out coal emissions over the next 20 years and leave the unconventional fossil fuels like tar sands in the ground, then CO2 would peak at something like maybe 425 ppm, and it would slowly decrease. It would take centuries to get back to 350, but by means of replanting the forests on marginal lands, there are some ways we could get it to come down more quickly. But the fundamental point is that we would have to phase out the coal emissions rapidly, and we'd have to leave the unconventional fossil fuels in the ground. But what's actually happening? The United States has recently signed an agreement with Canada for a pipeline to carry tar sands oil to Texas oil refineries. And coal-fired power plants are being built all around the world. So there's a huge gap between the rhetoric and the reality. The politicians say the right words. They say we have a planet in peril, and yet their actions are really greenwash because they're very small perturbations to business as usual. In fact, if we look at what happened since the Kyoto Protocol went into effect, emissions were going up 1.5% per year prior to that. And since then, despite this recession of the last 2 years, the emissions have grown 2.5% per year. And governments are just going right ahead. You may have seen the article in the New York Times a few days ago. It had words this large that said, fuel will be found, or something to that effect. They're just assuming we can burn all the fossil fuels. And this guarantees disaster for young people if we do that. So the fundamental problem is this, and it took me a long time to realize this, even though it's so simple. It's as certain as the law of gravity. As long as fossil fuels are the cheapest energy, people are going to keep using them. Of course, why are they cheapest? Partly because they're subsidized, but mainly because they don't have to pay their cost to society. The human health effect of air and water pollution from fossil fuels is enormous. 1 million people a year die from air and water pollution, but much more than that, people's health are affected, and those medical bills are borne entirely by the public. Fossil fuel companies don't have to pay for that, nor do they have to pay for the damage to the environment or to the future of young people. Those costs are external. So what we should do is clear enough. We have to make the fossil fuels pay for their true costs. That means apply a fee, but it has to be very simple. It should be across the board at the first sale, at the domestic mine or the port of entry. And all of the money, I think, has to be returned to the public. You do not want Congress trying to decide where they're going to invest this money, which special interest they're going to give it to, or for them to try to pick winning technologies. of course, the government needs to provide some support for technology development, but not from this money. This money should go 100% to the public, and that way the marketplace will make the decisions as to what the winning technologies are. And that's a point which Republicans, by the way, and conservatives can appreciate. There's even an organization, I think it's Republicans for the Environment or for Conservation, which has read about this fee and dividend, and they say that's exactly what is the appropriate approach. Let the market make the decision. It does not require any increase in the size of government. All they have to do is divide by long division, divide by the number of legal residents and send them the money. And that way you keep the big banks out of it. There's absolutely nothing added by the big banks. They don't need to be involved in this. And it's the only way that you can get a global agreement. How can you possibly, there's no way that China or India is going to accept a cap. And why should they? Their emissions per capita are much smaller, and their contribution to the climate problem is much, much smaller because it's the integrated emissions over time, the cumulative emissions that cause the climate change. And we're 10 times more responsible than China, even though China's emissions now exceed ours. We're 10 times more responsible per capita for the climate change. So the merit of this approach is that it would stimulate the economy and put money in the public hands. And that's the only way that we're going to solve our fossil fuel addiction. And I think it's the only way that's feasible on an international basis. I'd like to draw attention to the intergenerational injustice of what we're doing and what our governments are continuing to do and to do nothing about. And that is the fact that, as I said at the beginning, the people who cause the problems are not the ones who suffer the consequences. And this, if the public understood this, parents have always been willing to sacrifice for their children, let alone doing the opposite, where they're causing enormous problems for them. And this is true of all cultures. But the problem is that the governments think that they can set the emissions at whatever level they choose. So I think, I put in to remind me, I wanted to acknowledge the many young people who are at this conference today, and I think the only way we're going to solve this problem is if young people begin to get involved and put pressure on the government to do what is needed. And some of us, although we're amateurs, are trying to do some things to draw attention to this. So you may have heard about this Million Letter March. Well, that is why this day we wanted to take some photos of. Sophie is my first grandchild, and so she was writing a letter to President Obama, and she did this on the spot. And she wrote some very sensible things. She said, "Why don't you listen to my grandfather?" That morning, her younger brother, Connor, and I had been trying to burn a piece of coal. I wanted to show them how dirty coal is. So she also had that in her letter. And so I was reading her letter, and she was looking at me to see if I was approving her letter. She seemed pretty confident that I was going to approve it. And then we were celebrating her good letter. But I also, now my son has 2 children. So now we have 4 grandchildren. And Jake he's just 2.5 years old, but he's a giant for his age. He's a gentle giant. He's in the upper 1% for his size, so the charts say he's going to be 2 meters tall. And he thinks he can protect his baby sister. Here, his baby sister is just 2.5 days old in this photo. But the truth is, if we don't get on a different path, that it doesn't matter how strong these young people are, they're not going to be able to fix the problem if the dynamics begins to take